Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I'm your host, Scott Paladin, and with me, as always, is the peanut butter to my jelly, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
So I have kind of a weird idea to discuss with you. It's a take on trolls and undead.
Okay. Those aren't normally related.
Yeah, two creatures that you don't typically think of together. But I think that they can represent two elements of the world, sort of. Well, let me back up a bit. You know trolls. Yeah. Commonly are thought to be regenerating creatures.
That's the D&D version of them.
Yeah, and that's the one I'll be focusing on for this particular bit here. So the thing about trolls is you cut off their body parts, it grows back. Where does that material come from?
Exactly, yeah.
If you take kind of the science approach to it, you know, they're going to burn out of energy, whereas the conservation of matter and energy is not observed with trolls.
Yes, exactly. You the old thing I remember from you telling a story about troll slaw.
Oh yeah. So to throw just a quick little story here, we had a D&D type game where the party had managed to subdue a troll out on the high seas, and to supplement our rations, we used an infinite amount of grated troll.
Grated troll. Sorry, it's still funny.
But that does raise a lot of questions about, like, where is all this mass coming from?
Right, because it's not like the troll has to eat an equal amount of other of substances or whatever to turn that into troll. It just makes it out of nowhere. Yeah.
So if that doesn't sit well with you as a DM or a storyteller, you might start to think, well, where is this mass coming from? Well, in D&D, there's often been the idea of a positive and a negative plane of energy. Where
sort of diametrically opposed.
Yeah. And sources. You know, it's just sort of an easy way for them to be like, oh, forces of light, forces of darkness, or, you know, forces of healing, forces of decay, that kind of thing. But I always thought it'd be kind of interesting if maybe trolls were associated with the positive plane of energy, with sort of that healing and regeneration aspect.
Right. So when they have, you know, when you cut the arm off a troll and it grows a new arm, it is literally pulling that mass and energy from the positive plane of energy, from this like sort of endless supply of just, you know, positive healing life energy.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Although it seems to create an imbalance, which is I think where we're going with, you mentioned undead, right?
Yeah, the undead, commonly associated with the negative energy plane. It'd be kind of interesting if they were sort of a balancing force. Maybe the trolls are constantly introducing this positive energy and sort of form sort of the positive end of the battery, as it were. And undead were sort of funneling life force out of the world into the negative.
Right, right. So in sort of thermodynamics talk, like the troll would be a source, a life source, and the various forms of undead who can suck life force out of the universe and sort of not destroy it, but shunt it out of the material plane would be a sink. They would be like a life sink.
Sure.
Cool.
I also kind of like the idea that maybe trolls at one point in the distant past were maybe these avatars of goodness and light and regeneration, and just over time from having their limbs hacked off over and over and over again, and constantly regenerating, they just kind of mutated over time into these feral monsters.
That's cool. You could also, the version of it that I was sort of thinking about was, it's not that they were like sort of created on purpose to be this thing. It's that when things get too far out of balance, that the sort of pressure of having too little positive energy in the material plane sort of opens a rupture, like as a fluke, causes a break. And
interesting.
Just maybe they sort of represent a weak point where positive energy just starts flowing into the world, and if it happens to coincide with a creature, that creature gets regenerative powers.
Interesting.
That would imply you have to maintain that balance. Otherwise, like, there would be too little life force in the world and everything would fall dead. And just sort of the same way with air pressure, where if you have a low pressure zone and a high pressure zone, it'll start trying to find its way through. Yeah. And so trolls and other regenerating creatures might be just sort of like a little leak where the stuff flows through. And because it's not designed, it wasn't created that way, they're just sort of reacting violently to this. Like, it's like they're sort of a chaotic life energy at that point.
Sure, yeah.
Which would be kind of cool. I
also kind of like the idea, like, what happens when that leak doesn't coincide with a living creature?
Ooh.
What does that look like?
Yeah. So if you've got creatures that are, well, actually, you know what? If it's chaotic life force that's coming through, maybe the leak forms a creature around it.
That would make sense, yeah.
Right. Like, so if you open a pinprick hole in between the plane of positive energy and the material plane, that life force energy coming through, just like the moment that it hits the prime material plane, it creates life. And almost like a scab forming over it, a creature like comes into being, and that is a troll.
Like, I like the idea of it sort of like generating like these little, almost like eggs in the world.
Oh, yeah.
That'll hatch into these monstrous creatures or whatnot.
Yeah, it wouldn't be an egg. It would be like a sack of meat, basically.
Of course, it's always sacks of meat with you.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I do have a brand. Of course, you don't have to have it. You could make it very formulaic. Like, this is what happens. It'll always result in this result. But maybe it's it could go different ways. Like, if it comes into a zone where there's lots of plant material, or if it comes into like a jungle or something and it's surrounded by plant material, maybe it coagulates that plant material and creates a very, maybe it's just all like it's a troll, quote unquote, but it's made of bark and vines and logs and things. It's just like a troll is what happens when these living forces animate. Like, they have so much life energy flowing through them, they just have to start moving and going through the world, and also growing and regenerating if they're ever damaged. That could be kind of cool.
So in that case, we talked about like what happens when there's not enough life force in the world, and so we get kind of like that rupture from their side. Is it kind of the other way, like where when there's too much life force, the undead sort of form as a natural reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that would make sense. Or at least some version of that same sort of sink property, where you have to have this life force flowing back out of the prime material plane, because if there was too much, it would sort of overwhelm everything. And you can't have everything be alive. Like, it creates another form of that, of sort of that pressure differential. And you find places where it can sink into the negative material or negative energy plane. Right? That one I have a harder time imagining. Like, you create that pinprick leak. You don't get the creature creating itself around there. It seems like that would almost be like a place phenomenon. Whereas undead might be a way that someone has figured out sort of how to hack that pressure differential.
Oh, sort of like an artificial release valve.
Yeah. Like, they cut a little hole in themselves, basically, like use themselves as a vessel to channel energy from the material plane into the negative energy plane. And in doing so, give themselves, like, they're able to siphon off a little bit of it.
What if making undead was like the lesser of two evils when you're dealing with that sort of release mechanism? Like, if creating these undead was something that, say, necromancers or whatnot did, because if they didn't, it would be catastrophic. Like, the natural mechanism for correcting that. Yeah,
going back to sort of this idea of pressure differentials, imagine if you didn't have a release valve on something that was building pressure inside. Eventually it explodes, right? You could imagine a world where somebody has figured that out and it starts creating undead specifically to relieve that pressure and allow some of that life energy to escape back out of the world.
I'm picturing like the doomsday scenario for too much life energy in the world being sort of like a gray goose scenario almost.
Oh yeah, where everything starts coming alive and
nothing can die.
Nothing can die, and things start animating on their own, and even like becoming sentient on their own. Until there's just more and more of it, and it becomes more and more chaos. This, to me, like, this version of that life energy feels very chaotic for me, to me. And if you're going to go by chaos versus order, that means that the undead suddenly become a more force of order in the world, which I think makes sense, because lifelessness, that sort of death, is about things stopping change. In fact, maybe, so if you associate the undead with order, maybe that explains kind of like why when you use this energy you sink the life energy out of the world through an undead creature, it stops decaying. Because you are removing its ability to change through this process, which I think that makes sense. It has sort of a thematic.
I think you open yourself up to a really interesting story mechanic where you could have a protagonist as sort of this law-keeping necromancer.
Oh, okay.
Like, who's, living in a world of just abundant, dangerous life.
Yes. Oh, that's cool. You have him kind of trying to find a way to shunt off these difficult energies by using necromantic forces. That could be very cool. Yeah, I like that. Backing up just a second, because I want to riff off an idea you mentioned earlier, which we kind of moved away from. The idea that you have a creature that has regenerative properties and starts off like normal and good and becomes because of the way the regeneration works.
Mm-hmm.
This is an idea I had a while back, and I love it, which is that trolls start off normal looking.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, maybe they'd be they're not trolls yet. Trolls like what they become, but you have some creature that, let's say it coincides with one of these sources of energy, or either accidentally, like it just happened through natural forces, or it's engineered, like they're looking for a way to sustain themselves, give themselves life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they go through a procedure to make this happen, and then it gives them almost perfect regenerative properties. Where like you cut yourself and you're gonna heal back quickly. You're gonna have a tiny little scar there, or you break your bone. It heals back immediately, but you have a tiny little, like, thicker part of the bone there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the longer that they have that regeneration ability present and they break it and they use it, they certainly morph over time into more and more scar tissue. And it takes a while, but they start off very normal looking. And then 200 years down the road, they are huge monsters covered in scar tissue and like with these huge thick bones and stuff. And you could even go so far as to say maybe what they grow back is a little bit more resistant to whatever hurt them each time. So a regenerator or a troll that has been living in a fiery, like living near a volcano and getting burned all the time, becomes more and more heat resistant over time.
Oh, yeah.
And then becomes, very, very acclimated to that sort of environment. And it'll look very different than one who had been living in like a swamp where it's very resistant to rot and acid all the time, because that's the environment that it's in.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
So, I mean, and that works off the same sort of principle that we're talking about. This wouldn't be an egg where it's just kind of a naturally occurring troll. This would be one that was, was a creature.
Well, it was engineered almost.
Yeah. Yeah. A purposeful troll.
Following on the kind of the idea of engineering that, I like the idea, like commonly druids are associated with maintaining a balance.
Yeah. Okay.
Either between, law and between civilization and nature. I like the idea that there's sort of a group of druid-like figures that maintain purposely this balance between negative and positive energy.
Yeah.
And they're monsters because there's no good way to maintain that. Either you're making undead.
Yeah.
Or you're inflicting, damage on these creatures to bring this regenerative property.
Yeah.
And so they're like this feared.
Yeah, they're doing the dirty work.
Yeah.
That nobody respects because because it takes that monstrous form. That's really cool. Okay, so if they're an order of balance, so they would have amongst their ranks, they would have both necromancers and I wouldn't want to say there isn't necessarily a D&D equivalent to it, but I'm thinking of like the white mage.
Yeah, kind of.
Like where it's all about positive energy. Cleric is kind of the closest thing D&D usually normally uses, but they're so strongly associated with a god that I kind of am reluctant to use it.
I was almost thinking more like medieval torturers, where they are just inflicting grievous injury on these creatures that have been found to be conduits to stoke that.
That seems more like the negative energy side of it. By causing the damage, they're sort of removing the life force a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense, I suppose.
Yeah, or unless it's like they're going through the regenerative process as sort of a way of, I'm trying to think of like, they're essentially using the troll as like a release valve.
Yeah.
Going through the torturing or whatnot, this horrific thing that they're doing, or at least maybe it's not actively horrific, but it really seems horrific. Where, okay, so pulling in a little bit of real science, we're talking about when like regeneration and sort of this extra life actually has a lot in common with cancer.
Yeah.
Cancers are when cells do not follow the signals that when they're told to shut themselves down and die. Because there's cellular chemical signals says, okay, you're done, cell. We don't need you anymore. We're going to bring out a new batch. You need to kill yourself. And they go through autophagy and all that. And when they don't do that properly, that's cancer. And in lots of cancers, they will also begin to multiply more. And so that you can pull in that same idea for this order when they create that regenerative abilities, that's going to come in the form of like tumors and sickness, where, and again, we're talking about a world where positive life energy is associated with chaos in a lot of ways. And so if it's not really carefully managed, if you're just sort of opening the valve on it, you're going to get the most chaotic version of it, where instead of nice, perfect regeneration every time, you get tumors and gross and mutations as it reforms, which will seem very monstrous and horrific.
You kind of get like that Akira effect.
Oh yeah, totally. Ugh, yeah. Okay, there's a real type of tumor as well where it'll grow different tissue types.
Oh yeah.
I cannot remember the name of it. I cannot remember the name of it. But like they have torn these things open and found hair and teeth inside of them. Oh, that's gross.
I hate it.
And that is a real thing. But you can imagine, like, if actually, here's a good idea. If this is what happens when the pressure builds too great, where it's the life energy starts starting to erupt in the world, that's kind of what these druids are fighting against.
Yeah.
They're using it in a very controlled, careful way in order to prevent these things from breaking through and causing disease sort of randomly. They're sort of shunting that energy into specific areas. And so they might be taking creatures which are, I guess, condemned criminals might be the sort of tropey way to do it, where you're like, you take a creature and you're like, okay, this is a sacrifice. We need to release this energy into a vessel. We're going to use them. And they start, opening them up, and they start growing tumors. They start mutating greatly. And like, it's awful. But the idea is that you're pushing all of this pressure into a single entity so that it doesn't just happen randomly in the world. And by doing that, you get less cases of, disease and cancer and sort of random regeneration out in the populace. But the populace doesn't like that. Like they don't really see the benefits of it because it's the absence of something. Instead, they just see these horrible monsters these druids are creating.
Maybe once, like long ago, their order was much more established, and like they introduced this positive energy into the world as healing, and whatnot. And so they were, respected members, but because they also had that flip side of necromancy, they were started to be viewed with suspicion, and then they were hunted down. And now there's only a few of them, and because their scope is limited,
they have to be much more extreme in their measures.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, that's hot. Yeah, so it used to be that the little healing that they did was enough of a pressure release. But now, because there's so few of them, they have to be very drastic, which makes them look even worse.
Exactly.
And it really screws up their public image. Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
I do like the idea that maybe the way this negative energy sort of manifests over time is through like decreased birth rates and whatnot. So, or like, failing crops. So there's kind of like
pestilence.
Yeah, and there's sort of that simple folksy side of like, oh, we need our crops blessed. We need, our fertility rates blessed.
Right.
That the druids kind of fulfill that need in fixing.
Yeah. Or at one point they did, and they are not doing it now at the same time. Yeah. So we're talking about this sort of balance. It doesn't have to be the entire material plane doesn't have to have the same positive versus negative energy balance.
Sure.
So part of it is also like, okay, we've got positive energy coming in over here, and we've got negative energy coming in over here. How do we channel it from one to the other and like get these syncs going in the right, getting this transfer in the right way, and like what happens in the path between them might be interesting. I also, we're talking about how these guys are doing things in secret. I kind of like the idea that, or not, maybe not secret, but like they are really like hunted and disliked. So they might be masquerading as other things. Like one of these druids might be pretending to be a priest to bless crops and stuff. Yeah. And doing his work covertly as he moves through the world, which he feels and probably is very necessary, but that if anyone found out just what he was doing, it would cause huge problems. Yeah. I think we've talked a good amount about the sort of the positive side of it, where we've got all this regeneration. Let's delve a little bit into that negative end.
So an interesting idea would be like, we always think of undead as, the wandering zombies, the wraiths, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Or vampires and liches.
Oh, sure. Yeah. It would be kind of interesting if they started off doing like raising pets or animals or vermin or whatnot as kind of a minor release valve for undead negative energy.
Yeah.
And then there are some times where it's just, that's not enough. You need the humans, or perhaps a better source or container for this negative energy.
Right. And it's also one of those things where, like, if you come into an area that's got too much positive energy, it would be overgrown, and you'd have lots of like creeping vines, and sort of, we strongly associate things like rot with death.
Yeah.
But the truth is, rot is from little tiny creatures feeding on biology, which means that you'd actually have like things would be rotting and decaying, and like creatures would be growing tumors and stuff. And so one of these guys would come into the area and start to really tamp down on all of that at once. And sort of that's the best case scenario, is where you'd come into one of these overgrown areas and they'd start tamping all of that down and using like I think you said, lesser creatures originally. But even what would happen if you used necromancy on a plant? What does that create?
Oh.
Because we sort of think of necromancy as giving something animation without life, kind of. But maybe, here's an idea. Okay, so
whatever it is, it feeds on grains.
God damn it. Okay. Okay.
I had to.
No, it's fine. No, I get it. So what I was thinking is actually like if you're using necromancy to preserve something in its more lifelike state, you're removing its ability to change. It might actually seem like preservation.
Yeah.
Like if you walked into a granary and used a necromantic spell, it would prevent all of the rot in that granary, and so it would preserve that food for much longer. And I mean, I always strongly associate necromancy with things like cold and stuff. Like it might actually have originally been like they discovered this whole life-sinking energy in order to preserve food. I like the idea of the original necromantic spells a lot being like keeping our dead preserved out of respect. Because that's a very common thing amongst cultures. Like we want to protect them. And it sort of develops from there into the more drastic versions of it, where you have to be imbuing more and more of that energy into the thing in order to, shunt away this buildup of positive energy. That could be very cool. So there is some like low level usefulness to it. And then also, I mean, there's the high level stuff too. Zombies traditionally were like servants. Like we think of the zombie as being sort of like a plague outbreak. But the original like legend was that you would create a zombie to be your slave. And so the first zombies, and maybe it was, oh, well, my cattle have died, but I need to finish plowing this field. You raise them as zombie cattle.
Yeah, I do like the idea of the undead as sort of a free labor source.
Yeah, well, and they could take over a lot of the things that, like in modern society, we would use engines for. In a world where you don't have internal combustion or electricity, we need somebody to mill this grain. We could make a windmill, or we could raise a zombie and he could push this lever and mill the grain for us. And if that's available, and in fact, at that stage when this society is still doing their job of keeping things in balance and they're publicly accepted, that's just like the best option. You're using something which would be waste and also kind of dangerous, as a rotting corpse might be. And instead you preserve it, sterilize it, and put it to work. And it's also removing more of that life energy, which you need to keep in balance. Okay, so we can kind of imagine how the world would be if there's too much positive energy, if there's too little positive energy, or I guess the way to also phrase that would be too much negative energy. That would be like crops dying, or just not growing, like failing to thrive maybe.
Yeah, and fertility rates going way down in a particular area.
And like in that case, like also wounds not healing.
Yeah.
Like people, you get a cut on your arm and it never closes up.
Maybe food not nourishing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In fact, one of the things is maybe if you push that preservation too far, you create food, which not only like you won't be able to gain sustenance from it anymore, but then at a certain point, like eating it actually causes you to waste away because there's too much negative energy of it. Like you've removed all of the stuff that would normally be in it to sustain someone.
I like that.
And so it's all about like you can do it, but it becomes less and less useful over time until it becomes actually harmful. Because everything about this whole system is about keeping things in balance. So if you do too much of any one thing, it's always got to have a problem. In fact, okay, so if you're going to use this system that we're sort of riffing on, that is an invaluable what's the word?
Involuntary?
No.
Invaluable?
No, you cannot break it. Unbreakable. So let me just. So
Sure.
if you're going to use this system,
that's going to bother me now. But
okay, well, we got time. Give her
imperishable.
No, it's like maybe my brain just made this. I want to say like inviolable, but that's not right.
Infrangible?
No, that's not it. Again, maybe my brain just made it up. Hello, Editor Scott here. Some of you will also be unable to think of this word, and it'll be bothering you. Others of you will be screaming into your podcast app, inviolable, inviolable, in increasingly exasperated tones. Well, be comforted by the fact that I looked it up far too late to do anything about it. Now, back to the podcast. I don't know what I'm thinking of. I know there's a word like right on the edge, and I'm going to think of it 2 or 3 days from now, but I cannot think of it. So that's fine. We'll put it out of our minds.
All right.
If you want to play around with the system, one of the most fundamental laws is that if you do any one good thing too much, it turns bad.
Sure.
That sustaining life with positive energy is useful to a point, and then the more you use it, the less useful it becomes, until it becomes actually harmful.
Sure.
Where trying to heal someone too many times, too much energy, too much healing all at once results in cancer or mutation or monstrous growths. At the same time, trying to preserve something and turn it into or like make a useful zombie or something like that, if you keep that going too long or you put too much negative energy into it, it starts like either it removes the useful parts of it and then becomes harmful, or like if you put too much energy into a zombie, like normal zombies, okay, so here's a cool idea. Normal zombie, just an engine, right? You just put in negative energy, or you put in energy, life energy of some sort, and it turns it into motion.
Sure.
Do that too long and too much, and eventually it becomes hungry for that energy. And that's when they turn around and start becoming dangerous. And that's where a zombie plague might break out, is because you pushed that too far. Whereas under normal circumstances, they're useful. And that explains, I think, a lot of things like vampires. A vampire would be this like a spell that normally would take someone on the verge of death and maybe sustain them for a little bit longer.
Sure. By feeding them life force.
Exactly. You feed them some life force. It keeps them going for a little while. You do that too much, they become addicted to it, and they have enough power to become dangerous with it.
So it's almost like a delta P for negative energy, where it just kind of funnels through this one point, and suddenly you have this flow that just can't stop going through.
Exactly, where it tries to start sustaining itself. Yeah. And like the hole becomes bigger and it needs more and more. I think that also puts an interesting twist on things like liches and vampires, which is that I always find it really boring that they sort of hit a steady state and then just persist like that forever as long as they're given blood, or even if they're not. Some versions of vampires, like they'll turn into dust, and if you drop like one drop of blood on them 500 years later, they're going to come back.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Screw that. I like the idea that you get a vampire going and it's going to get worse and worse and more powerful, or you're going to kill it. Like you have no choice. Like it's going to get worse over time.
You got to plug up that hole or
yeah. It's almost like erosion. Like if you have a lake and you get a little hole on the side of the lake that starts flowing out, the action of that water flowing through widens it over time and makes it harder and harder to stop.
Sure.
And so it's the same way with a vampire. You get a little tiny hole of that energy. If you don't manage it, then at some point it gets more and more energy flowing through it, which it's sort of siphoning off part of that each time, in order to create itself more powerful.
I like the idea that they start off like, you give them a little bit of blood and whatnot, and they're cured. And then later on, they're having to drink blood to sustain themselves.
Yes.
And maybe later on, they're just exsanguinating people.
Yeah.
As they walk by them.
Yes. And it also allows you to, because vampires in fiction have such a weird set of powers sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Dracula can turn into a wolf or a swarm of bats, but also like has like telekinesis and stuff and can enslave people. But there's also versions of vampires that are just a little bit stronger. Well, like you can imagine that being sort of a sliding scale where the first version of a vampire is just a regular person who's being sustained by blood, and then they get a little stronger, they get a little bit more weird, they start having weaknesses to things like sunlight, and then by the end game of a vampire, they're like a demon lord, they've turned into a monster because they have incredible powers where they can shapeshift and control things with their mind, and they can enslave populations because they have access to so much energy being flowed. That's not right at all. No. They have access to so much energy being transferred from the material plane into the negative energy plane. They can siphon off a little bit of that, just to sustain themselves and to amass great power at the same time.
I like the idea that at the end of it, like at the very end of it, they're just maybe not even any trace of humanity is gone. They're just literally a black hole of negative energy just creeping across the landscape from a fixed point.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Even the corporeal body breaks down and they are just a a natural phenomenon at that point, like a storm or a sinkhole.
Like a mega wraith that's just kind of expanding from a certain point.
And you can have the exact opposite on the positive side as well, where you have a creature that starts off as like a troll, or like, maybe we have one of our creatures that was, somebody suffered a grievous injury, so you use a regeneration spell on them. They regenerate. Happens a few more times. It happens too often, and now it's part of them, and they regenerate all the time. And they use that too much, and then they become like this monstrous troll that moves through the countryside destroying things. And then that keeps going. And eventually that turns into just a mass, like a living mass that is expanding through the countryside at the same time. What would it look like when those two things smash up against each other?
Interesting.
Whatever happens, it's like that's where the prime material starts to break down, because you have like almost a pure form of life energy coming out of one hole and then going across and going down into another hole.
And maybe the dangers of that particular instance happening, like the prime material plane gets bypassed, and suddenly you just have, the negative material plane and the positive material plane just funneling back and forth, and the prime material plane is just left out of the loop there, and maybe they just go stagnant.
Where it doesn't have, all sense of balance breaks down because like it's not getting filtered through the prime material plane anymore. It's just sort of like a pipeline. Okay. Maybe that's one type of ley line.
Interesting.
Like if this happens, you've got these two things. If you can match them up to each other before they get to like catastrophic world ending levels, if you manage to create the channel between the two of them, you've got a source of life energy and a sink of life energy. You lock them down, wherever they are. And then using, necromancy and other magics, you manage to get a flow of that energy from one to the other, sort of a pipeline, sort of a like a metaphysical pipeline. And you get that solidified. It is allowed to flow naturally. Now, some of it's going to leak off and bend to the system, and that's all right, but it becomes permanent part of the world. And then it becomes something you can access later. Like it's almost like a scar on the prime material plane.
Interesting.
Where something bad has happened. The druids have managed to fix it. And they've created this ley line where energy flows up out of one plane and then moves along the prime material and then flows out in a controlled way.
Sure.
And they've got the clamps down on it. And it's really just there to keep like things from breaking down further. It's a Band-Aid, it's a scar. And these things happen over time. And that's where like ley lines in the world have built up, is like, they're just the result of nearly averted disasters. We're talking about sort of life energy. But you can imagine like the same sort of energy from other energy planes, like where a plane of heat and a plane of cold have, we had the same sort, some other group or something like that managed to channel that energy. And that creates a place where temperature energy is being channeled through the prime material. And that's where like an evoker, somebody who can create fireballs, would be able to siphon off some of that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And this sort of creates a network. Every time it happens, it's kind of dangerous. And if you disturb them too much, like you could result in the same problem that we nearly averted before. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, that kind of creates areas of very fragile but very powerful effects.
Yeah, and it brings us back to that theme of getting too close to power could cause bad things to happen. Drawing a little bit on this ley line energy is good. It makes your spells more powerful. It gives you access to new abilities. It allows you to do things you wouldn't normally be able to do. Do it too much, and you disrupt the process, and then things start going haywire again.
It's a very interesting take on it. I like that.
Yeah, this is a weird world.
Yeah,
I like it. Okay, so this sort of secret service that we've created of druids who are managing this life energy. They used to be big and powerful. Like you can kind of, or not even maybe not even big and powerful, but they were omnipresent.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe they weren't centralized. Every village had some guy who just kind of did this. And so it was they had lots of respect for balance. So think about why they might have been turned against. We could think about like, why is balance bad for some people?
Well, suppose that you've got this guy who walks in and says, I have the power to heal your son, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
Because we need to release, this life energy, let it go. If I were to introduce more, it'll be bad. Well, that's your son, this druid.
Exactly. Because they are all about like, we have to do things in moderation. The safest way to do it is to do it a little bit of a time. But we obviously have access to great power, not just like on the personal level of this is my son, but I'm the head of the village and it would be really great if we had an army of zombies to fight the next village over.
Sure, yeah.
But our local priest says no. Well, I'm not going to be super happy about that, especially if the priest next door says yes.
Yeah.
And they raise an army of zombies, and now I have to do the same or some equal amount of escalation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this idea of maybe ambition also getting in the way, and where these people normally their job is to say no when it's necessary.
Yeah.
If enough of them say yes, that leads us into problems where they do something too big, and they start creating this disruption that they're meant to fight.
Mm-hmm.
That could be kind of cool. So there might have been like an era of great war before, or disruption, or where enough of these we called them druids. I called them priests for some reason. You have enough of these guys who stood up and acted against their vows to create balance, where things went freaking haywire. And then maybe that's why we have all these ley lines over the world now, is that like somebody had to come back in and clamp down and heal the world afterward. And everybody's really pissed at these guys now because they were associated with this time of great struggle.
Maybe a long, long time ago, there were two factions. There was, these necromancers who handled that side of it. And then there's another group, like maybe midwives or something like that, had like these mystical powers associated with bringing life into the world.
Yeah.
That there were healers and, like I said, midwives. And at some point, someone was like, hey, creating all these zombies created something really bad here.
Yeah.
We should kill all the necromancers. And so they just kind of went away after a while or killed off, which left sort of this void. And in the meantime, we're introducing all this flourishing life into the world constantly. And I was like, this is great until it wasn't.
Yeah, until you started to have crops mutating and like becoming dangerous, and like you had people getting huge tumorous growths on them.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, there's a really good argument, just like rot is a form of life, disease is a form of life. Like viruses and bacteria are all forms of life, and they would be very happy under a positive energy surge.
Yeah.
And so you might get these incredible amounts of disease and sickness because of a buildup of stuff like this.
So like maybe there's some plague or something that results because of all this. And so these remaining group is now left to pick up the slack of the group that was previously killed off, the necromancers or whatnot.
Yeah.
And so they kind of go from being this force associated with only one to trying to maintain that balance and becoming sort of this druidic force.
Yeah. So they used to be like, they're just sort of the order that was left over. And maybe they adopted some of the old necromancers, the ones who managed to make it through, just so they could learn some of that same stuff. And then they were handling both sides of the equation. Whereas previously they might have been in conflict with one another, thinking that they were both because they were both handling one half of the equation. Sure. And they thought, well, if we just did all of it, it would be better. These guys are doing it the wrong way. And then they find out what happens when they win.
Yeah.
And now they handle both. Cool. So we had been using the word druid. If we're going to have an opposite of necromancer, I think the word we might use is biomancer.
That's a pretty common trope for anyone who deals with
the magic of life.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got the biomancers and the necromancers. Can we combine those for the result too? Necrobiomancer, bionecromancer. Bionecromancer sounds pretty good.
It's interesting. Yeah. I feel like there's definitely like some kind of cool word you could use to describe this sort of gray agent of life and death.
Yeah, there's probably also a Greek word for balance or something like that, where it's keeping everything in check. Well, we hardly ever name things properly on this, so we don't need to worry too much about it. We've got a world where if you push too hard on any of this energy, bad things happen. We've had it's a world where things have gone very badly in the past because one side got out of balance. And in fact, now we've got another, not just the dichotomy of life and death, positive versus negative energy, but also this balance of like, push it too hard, go too ambitiously on something, and it will, bad things will happen. But you also need you can't slack off and have everything be the most simple version as well, right?
You can't just let it stagnate. You can't just like do away with all of this.
Right. And and that's part of human nature, is to like grow and have ambitions and to want to do more. Because if you stagnate and your society stagnates, then like that could lead to the opposite version where like things aren't getting out of control, but like, again, we have declining birth rates. That's a form of negative energy in the world. And so we sort of started talking in the D&D space where this like a huge pantheon, but this world that we're creating feels so much like it's just got two. Like it really is just positive, negative energy, the prime material, and maybe there's like two gods or instantiations of these energies, and they've got competing clergies or competing societies. Like everybody looks to one or the other. Like there's lots of different gods for different societies. Like everybody's got their version of these things, but they're all just avatars of the same force. Yeah. So you've got the nature gods like Pan or the Green Man or something like that, or and then you've got the death gods. You've got Thanatos and Hell and stuff like that from other areas, but they're all just various reflections of the god of this positive and negative energy sources. Some things like the sun might be strongly associated with positive energy because it gives life. And just by being opposite of the sun, you have the moon, which might be associated with negative energy. And you really could start drawing back almost everything in this world to one of these two sources, which is cool. I like that. Yeah. Volcanoes, I don't know which way you go on a volcano because they bring fire, which is death. Well, no, actually, this is great. I think they're very positive energy because a little bit of volcanic eruption, a controlled volcanic eruption, creates very, very fertile soil. Volcanic soil is great for growing crops. Too much of it burns your village down. Similarly, something like a glacier or ice would be strongly negatively associated because it preserves things. It can be a source of water, but too much of it and it's going to overrun a valley and crush your village. So it's like it's all about the balance between the two, and you can sort of define which way it goes.
It would be kind of interesting if you kind of broke away from like some of the more traditionally accepted diametrically opposed elements. Like suppose instead of like, heat and cold, it was water as a representation of life. Yeah. And then frost or cold as a representation of death. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense because, water is changeable and malleable. Whereas in this world, sort of the negative energy, the death is cold and stagnant. Yeah. And so the difference between water and ice is exactly along those lines. That works really well.
And they're the same element in the long run. They're both water. But because of the way it's viewed in these societies or whatnot, water is strongly associated with life and ice is death.
Yeah, I like that's actually great. On the same token, you'd have something like soil being associated with life and stone being associated with death.
Oh, absolutely.
Where, one is strongly associated with the crops and the things you grow in it, and it's changeable, you can mold it, and stone is set and lifeless. And so as opposed to it being earth versus sky, it's one version of earth versus another version of earth. Oh, is there a sky one? Let's think. Just to give our world a little bit more fantastic element, you have what we would call like living air, air that is breathable and is the one that we, that if you walk into an area with a regular atmosphere, you're just going to breathe. This might be a world where you have stagnant dead air.
Oh, interesting.
Which is maybe like all nitrogen.
Sure.
Or all nitrogen and carbon dioxide or something like that, where there'll be zones where there just isn't any life. In fact, assuming that lots of portents of death and negative energy kind of come together, it could be if you go into a cave or you're standing on top of a glacier, that the air there tends to die and be an atmosphere that you can't breathe anymore.
I like that, especially if there's like a visual element that you can represent to your viewer or your players.
Yeah. Something that they'll know, which means nitrogen doesn't work super well because it's colorless and odorless.
Well, sure, but if we're dealing with a fantastical world, you can hand wave that.
Yeah, exactly. You have to come up with something to delineate it. Or even just, maybe it's a smell or an absence of smell.
Oh, yeah.
Where you can't see it from afar necessarily, but like when you start getting close, you start to get some sense associated with air, and you're like, I don't like the way that you choose something that is a signifier of like staleness and not death, but like stagnance. Otherwise, you don't want to use rot, for example. You don't want to use.
But if like the air just feels like more stagnant, more heavy.
Yeah, and like. Oh, actually, if it's an area where there's no motion, like this heavy dead air might actually resist moving. The wind. So you might actually be able to see like a shimmering effect at the boundaries because fast moving living air might hit that boundary and they either commingle or like sort of bounce off each other, and it would probably create something like a heat shimmer effect.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen this is really cool because we're talking a little bit about water, but there's cenotes in Mexico where they have briny water and briny water and fresh water interacting, and it looks like an underwater river.
I've seen that. That looks really cool.
It looks really cool. So you can imagine something like that, almost a mirror in the air, hanging as the boundary between these two places.
Oh, that'd be an awesome phenomenon to introduce to your readers.
That looks really cool. Okay. I like that a lot.
I also like the idea that we talk about like the air being heavier or maybe more dense as it's kind of lost all the energy. Like if you can take, small particulate matter like leaves or whatnot, and they'll sit on top of the air without moving.
Oh, or even not just on top of it, but like if you had a handful of something very light like leaves and you're in this air and you just release it, they just very slowly, just like it's barely visible, the movement, because they're sort of suspended in like a gel almost. That could look really cool.
Yeah.
You imagine walking into one of these things and like the snowfall is like, it just creates like a barrier above it, and then there's these little tiny hanging flakes of snow in the air.
And then you breathe that in and you got that in your lungs, and good luck, buddy.
Yeah, it's terrible for you. Like you can imagine people with like respirators and stuff like that. Or this is one of the things that maybe zombies are good for, is you can send them into these zones because they don't require breathing air.
But over time they start generating that effect.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because they're so strongly associated with it. And it could also be the kind of thing where like, it's dangerous and you don't want to live in it. But if you had a barrel full of this dead air in your house and you like put food into it, it's going to be preserved because everything on the surface is going to die.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that might be one of the early versions of like food preservation as they started to learn this negative energy.
These dead air refrigerators.
Exactly. It would, again, we strongly associate with cold. So it would be like this sort of Stone Age refrigeration system that they've created.
I really like that. That's a really cool idea.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really hot. What else can we do with this? So we've got the traditional 4 elements. We've talked about water, air, and earth. So what's the dead version of fire?
Oh.
Because positive fire is very like that. Fire and like heat seems very, very associated with positive energy to me. But maybe it doesn't have one.
Because fire is kind of a reaction or like a chemical reaction. It might be sort of outside of this and maybe like thought of as almost like holy or because it might actually be fully associated with light and life because you introduce the heat from fire to frost and it becomes water.
Yes. Yeah, fire itself is just a positive force. The thing with no opposite, the thing with no negative. I'm trying to think of a way they could reverently call it. Yeah, I like that. That's really good. Seems like there should be something on the same. Like I guess we're talking about cold as the opposite side of that, where things that are associated with cold and darkness as well could also be associated with like light and life kind of go together well because the sun and things like that. And so the night and darkness and so the night sky. Oh, that's great. I like the idea that if you strongly associate things like darkness and cold with death, and in your world, this is absolutely true. The unchanging stars, like planets and the moon and the sun, all move and have phases and things like that. The stars beyond them don't, from our perspective. And so there is a huge, dark, unchanging world out there above you.
Interesting.
And in our culture, we would look up at the night sky and go, "Oh, that's beautiful. We see the stars. They're millions of light years away, and they're beautiful. And it's this huge complex system." These people would look up at. It's like staring at the face of death.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe there aren't practical associations with that, but there would be definitely thematic and visual associations with it. Like we were talking about how you release some snow or some leaves into that dead air, and it just sort of hangs there. That might be how they imagine the stars are. That it's just dead air out there.
Interesting.
Beyond our living atmosphere.
Yeah.
And they're all just hanging out there. And looking into, we talk about like the eyes are the windows of the soul. Like somebody who has is become a channel for the negative energy to move out of the world. You might like look into their eyes and see stars. You might see the night sky.
Oh, that's cool.
Right. When necromantic magic is done, it's highly associated with the night and moonlight. And like moonlight's, commonly associated to be silvery. And so that the very light around them might be sort of different and changed. And people think of the the gold, like bright white light of the sun is being like noticeably different than the light of the moon. That's really cool.
Yeah, also like we talked about the stars being associated with that. I like the idea of like meteors and whatnot falling to Earth being just a very bad omen or sign of like this star coming to Earth, and maybe there's even like some truth to that. Like there's element of death that has landed or punched a hole into the negative material plane where it lands.
Oh, that's cool. In fact, while we're thinking about this, if this is a planet circling a sun, it's a little world in balance between a positive energy source in the sun and a huge negative energy source in the world around, in the space around it.
Oh yeah.
And they're right in the balance on the boundary in the habitable zone, which makes this whole world that we're sort of working in on that little knife edge and having to maintain it.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think you can keep finding ways to bring it back to that theme, which I think really works. I definitely like the idea of, we think of meteors, shooting stars as being very much a special event and very, sort of, lots of people have warm feelings about them. But yeah, I love the idea that they'd be a dark portent. They often were in history, especially things like comets.
Oh yeah,
were thought of as omens of all kinds, and that usually means bad things.
Oh yeah.
And so the idea that a meteor falling to Earth and like crashing into the Earth, instead of it being like hot and a burning star, it comes and falls through the atmosphere and it's cold. And it hits the ground and it creates a pool of negative energy with dead air around it, and it becomes a dangerous zone where life can't exist.
Interesting.
And so that might be one of the jobs of our biomancers, our bionecromancers, who come in and have to heal over these things before they get worse and spread. That's really cool. So if we're talking about meteors, though, we have to talk about meteoric iron, because that's so strongly associated with like fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
Like you forge a metal out of this stuff.
Absolutely. And thus death metal was born.
Literal death metal. Okay, so I think you couldn't forge it. I think you can't throw heat into this stuff because it's going to act like such a sink. It's so strongly associated with a negative material plane that if you put it into a fire, the fire goes out.
Oh, interesting.
Like you shove it into a forge and the forge is ice cold immediately. So you have to find some other way to shape it. I don't know what that does something come to mind for you on that one? How would you shape like a cold, brittle metal? Maybe it's not brittle, maybe it's soft, but no, it's got to be hard. It's got to be so hard and unchanging because it's meant to not ever change.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about like you forge it by like wearing it away, or like sanding essentially, or
yeah, I could see like having to do like abrasive things to it to kind of just grind it away, or chisel it like obsidian.
Yeah, where you're flaking it.
Yeah,
totally. Okay, so they call it metal, but it's actually much more like a glass.
Sure, yeah.
And then it's cold. And it's the kind of thing where like if you make a sword of meteoric iron, it's cold. It sucks life force. It might act where just touching the actual metal like sucks the life force out of you and like kills a limb or a person if you hit them in the right spot, and it negates it. It is itself a sink into the other world, into this negative energy plane. That's really cool. And by the same token, maybe so you have the meteoric iron. Could you get a bit of the sun or something like that, or some like maybe like our Earth is still hot from its forming billions of years ago, and to a certain extent from radiation of uranium and stuff within our core. A large amount of it's just leftover heat. Maybe this world has a chunk of the sun inside of it in its core,
interesting,
which heats it from. That's where that's where all that geothermal energy comes from, and sometimes some of that gets spit up through the core.
Yeah, volcanoes and stuff.
Yeah. Actually, when you get a particular kind of explosive eruption where like a bit of the mantle gets pushed through the crust. You get these tubes, which is actually where diamonds are formed.
Interesting.
And diamonds being sort of sparkly and sort of colorless, you could have them strongly associated with either. I think that would be strongly associated with positive energy at that point. And so like that, while you're hunting, like digging through a tube that has all these diamonds in it, you might find like a chunk of the inner part of the Earth, which is sort of the antithesis of this. The meteoric metal. You have instead the one that is like a heat source and a source of life itself.
I like the idea that maybe this group of druids or bionecromancers like one of their calling cards is that they always have a tool constructed of both materials.
Okay, you mean one tool that has both, or two tools?
Or two tools.
Okay, yeah, one for doing one job and one for doing the other. And like, I kind of like the idea that the blade is the one of death, because it's strongly associated with death, but that you're not just gonna have two different knives.
Yeah.
That the one that's made of the heating metal has to be something else, like a crucible, maybe.
Oh yeah.
Like it's a little cup, and what you put into it heats up and changes and is imbued with positive energy. So it's good for making like potions of healing.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
And because the positive energy in this world is so strongly associated with change, putting metal in it would melt the metal and allow you to like pour it into a mold, right? Like it's all about changing and crafting. Whereas the blade is all about like precise cutting, and since it's cold, so you can do it like maybe that doesn't work as well. Maybe it shouldn't be a blade. Maybe
like a scythe or sickle or scalpel.
Scalpel's good because that seems very much like the medical instruments that a surgeon might use. It because I kind of associate surgery with necromancy for some reason. It just occurred to me. Maybe scalpel's not bad. Or a mirror. You have a crucible of the life metal, the positive metal, and the negative metal is a mirror. In lots of cultures, mirrors are associated with sort of capturing an image, and they're still and silvery, and I think they would be strongly associated with the moon as well.
Yeah.
And okay, so maybe that's an idea. The you could associate with them with like clarity, or like you see something special in that mirror.
Interesting.
Like using this mirror made of the meteoric iron, you're able to look in it and see something, and you get a different vision of it, because it's being reflected off of that surface.
It'd be interesting if that's how you're able to, spot maybe one of the sources or both sources of like the punctures or conduits between these two planes.
Yeah, it shows you, like, you can actually see the negative and positive energies being interacted with that mirror. I was thinking, is there a way to associate the negative energy with like divination or seeing? Because mirrors would be associated with that.
Interesting.
Where it's like, it's about seeing. Oh, okay. Maybe one of the aspects of the negative energy plane or negative energy in general is the idea that time is fixed. Like we're moving through it, but it's not, but the past and the future are all like set. You're just moving along an already set line. And so looking into that mirror, might allow you to look along that line and see things in the future and in the past, because it's not malleable. It's not changeable unless interacted with by a source of positive energy, which is a source of change. So like the world left to its own devices is going to be set on its own path, but the more positive energy that interacts with it, the more possibilities open up and the less accurate divination becomes.
Interesting.
That could be kind of cool.
I like the idea that kind of opens up more individuals who could be involved with these forces that aren't necessarily this one group we've decided on. So you could have a story about the old witch in the woods who lives out in the dead air zone, who can tell the future.
Yeah.
But she lives out there because that's the only place she can do it reliably.
Yeah, because that's the place associated with death. Yeah, I like that. We're already over an hour, but I kind of want to keep going.
I'm fine with that.
This is totally cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about our bio-necromancers, or druids who...
Well, we were talking about like the different tools of...
different tools. So we're talking about thinking maybe a mirror for the tool of death, and therefore divination would be strongly associated with them. For some reason, I think that like light, like emotion and passion would be strongly associated with positive energy, sort of that life-giving force. I think a crucible works kind of in that vein. Because you can think of the womb as sort of a crucible. Like that's a kind of interesting parallel you could draw there. And like you could have little rituals, like when someone is dead, you can capture their visage in a mirror, and that allows you to continue to see them after they've been put in the ground and rotted away. It's almost like, it's photography. Well, how did I miss this? Not now. By backing a piece of glass with silver and then treating it with lots of, it's a silver nitrate, I believe, but you treat it with chemicals. You capture that image and you take something which was malleable and changeable over time and you fix it instead. And so that might be something that these bio-necromancers have developed over time, and that becomes part of the negative energy association, like the part, that half of the world. And so you have things like death images and
So
a wall with your ancestors' photos on it and stuff to keep the reverence and keep them alive.
Yeah, I like the idea of that as sort of a form of accepted necromancy, is taking someone's picture or photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it keeps the past not alive, but it keeps it past
Preserved.
Preserved. That's the word. Yeah, absolutely. That's very cool. Yeah, like silver would fall onto the death side because it's so strongly associated with the moon, with its white color, and because I think it would have to be associated with the photography and stuff as well. Gold then would be coming in on the life side.
Yeah.
As sort of the opposite. They're often thrown against each other like that. So you would see your crucible that you use as a bionecromancer might be gilded around the edges. You might melt gold a lot. Gold doesn't oxidize, so you can melt it over and over again and form it into lots of different things over time, which is very cool. You can't do the same thing with things like aluminum and steel because you lose a little bit each time, whereas gold is reusable. So something like that can be reused like that would be very valuable in terms of changing. Like it changes and can be lots of different things. That's kind of cool. Let's see, what else? We've got... So fire is strongly associated with the positive, cold with negative, light with positive, dark with negative. So does that mean, okay, so are the positive and negative planes stagnant in themselves? Like, is there any change there? Like during the part of the year, does one have more power than the other? And does this energy sort of wane and
Sure,
flow?
I could see that.
There's lots of ideas of the thing that comes to mind is to say like the equinoxes and the solstices are when things start to change. So maybe there's just sort of a natural ebb and flow to it, like a tide basically, where starting at the winter solstice, life energy starts to pass back into the world. And it takes a long time because, you're at your coldest at that point, but then it peaks around the summer solstice and then flows back out. And so that might mean like you treat your dead differently depending on what time of year it is.
Oh, yeah.
Because if someone dies in the summer when positive energy is at its height, that means that rot is going to be at its height. I wonder if that means, would you think a society would lean into that more? Like it's the height of summer.
Time to make babies. Time to
make babies. But that also means that things like rot is at its highest. So would they fight extra hard to preserve a body at that point? Or do you think they might see like, no, there's no hope at this point. Let's just lean in and let it rot.
Maybe it's just considered just like a bad omen to die during this particular time of the year, or
could be. I was thinking like, maybe there's a season for making zombies.
Oh, interesting.
Like if someone dies in December, which is like close to the winter solstice, the positive energy is at its lowest. And okay, so yeah, I guess that makes sense. It's at its lowest, so you wouldn't want to make a zombie in the middle of winter because there's no reason to use that zombie to shunt off additional positive energy because it's already at its lowest.
But maybe it's easier to do it then.
Oh, in fact, maybe they sort of happen occasionally.
Yeah.
Like if under normal circumstances, it's only at like December, 20th, right before the solstice. If somebody happens to die, like right then, they might happen to become a zombie, and be animated. And they will sustain for a little while naturally. Somebody might die in the middle of winter and keep moving around and doing their job, being a little bit less human. And then as more positive energy flows back into the world, they'll continue to gather it a little bit around themselves, and either the rot will overcome them, or they will start shunting more and more of that positive energy into themselves and becoming more powerful.
Interesting.
So either they only last a couple of months and then fall apart and die properly, or they keep growing and become a problem, which it must be dealt with.
I like the idea of there being fairy tales or stories about if you meet a traveler on the road on December 20th, like there's something you're supposed to do to like make sure he's not a zombie or whatnot. Maybe something with breath or whatnot.
You have to see if their breath is warm. Yeah. Because if they're a zombie, it'll be cold because they're so strongly associated with cold.
There you go.
Maybe you breathe on a mirror to see it fog up. And that brings in the mirror association again. That could be kind of cool. And then similarly on the other end of things, like you could imagine just like this might be a world where like pregnancies don't necessarily last 9 months. They last until the positive energy is really high.
Interesting.
So like if you get pregnant in like May, like you'll have a 3-month pregnancy and it'll go really fast. And then almost everyone always gives birth around midsummer, always.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, yeah.
It creates some interesting ideas. Like you wouldn't have you'd have like these clusters of babies all born at the same time. Okay, this is a weird idea. you might be able to get pregnant multiple times during the year and then give birth to triplets at the midsummer.
Interesting. Yeah.
Or multiples. Like it just sort of builds up inside.
Maybe rather instead of celebrating birthdays, like it just becomes like
everybody's birthday is in the middle of summer, basically.
Yeah.
And so it gets rolled into that midsummer festival where it kind of, you don't have your individual, like, oh, I turned 1 year old on April 21st. It's like, no, everybody gets 1 year older right in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
And you just kind of don't have babies born in the middle of the winter. This might not be like a hard and fast rule where everybody is born on June 21st or whatever the summer solstice is.
Sure.
But like, it's just that they all really cluster there. And then what might be a really bad omen is having a baby born. I mean, it's a really good omen, is a baby born outside of that time. Like it means like for a farmer or something like that, if you have a baby born in December, that means that there's so much positive energy flowing around that, a baby can be born even in the dead of winter, which means that there's going to be lots of positive energy in the next coming year. And therefore your crops are going to be bountiful, but you're going to have to watch out also for things like disease and weeds and things like that, where things become too fecund and overgrown. Because everything's tied together by this positive and negative energy, they all get tied together and you can watch one to look at others. That could be really cool.
Yeah.
This is a weird world, and we have an extra long episode now, but I think it was worth it. So you want to end it here?
Yeah, this seems like a good stopping point.
All right. Well, bye. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Monster Mechanics. You can find links and show notes at our website, monsterpod.org, or if you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We can be found on Twitter at monstermpod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jakeways. All of the ideas produced during this podcast are released under a do what the fuck you want public license.